The train jolted to a stop, the iron wheels grinding against the frozen tracks. I could feel the cold seeping through the wooden planks beneath my boots as I stepped down onto the snow-covered platform. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and the distant rumble of artillery fire. This was Stalingrad, a name whispered with reverence and fear, a place we had all heard about, but none of us truly understood. Until now. I remember the sound of our breath, hanging in the air like ghostly whispers as we stood there, taking in the sight of the city. It was vast, sprawling out before us, a maze of factories and apartment blocks, half destroyed and shrouded in a blanket of dirty white. Smoke billowed from countless fires, black columns rising into the grey sky, blending with the clouds until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The Volga River cut through the city, a dark ribbon of ice winding its way through the ruins. It was beautiful in a way, but also terrifying, a city on the brink of death, and we were here to push it over the edge. Around me, the men were quiet, their usual banter and laughter subdued by the weight of what lay ahead. We had been through so much already, fighting our way across Russia, inch by bloody inch. We were tired, worn down by months of relentless battle, but we had been victorious. And so we believed no. We knew that we could do it again here. Stalingrad was just another city, another objective to be taken, another step on the road to victory, or so we thought. Hell of a place, isn't it? One of the men muttered beside me. I turned to see Otto, a young soldier from Hamburg, his face pale and drawn. He had been with us since the beginning, always quick with a joke, but now his eyes were dark, his expression grim. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. What could I say? The sight before us was beyond words. As we moved out, I took in every detail, trying to imprint it in my mind. The buildings loomed over us, their windows shattered, their walls pockmarked with bullet holes. Rubble lined the streets, twisted metal and broken glass crunching underfoot. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint echo of machine gun fire, a reminder that the enemy was close, too close. The Soviets were waiting for us, entrenched in the city, ready to defend it to the last man. Our orders were clear: take the city, no matter the cost. But as we marched through the ruined streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that this would not be as simple as our commanders believed. Stalingrad was not just a city, it was a fortress, a living, breathing beast that would not be tamed easily. The Soviets had turned it into a labyrinth of death, every building a stronghold, every street a potential killing ground. We passed civilians huddled in doorways, their faces hollow, eyes staring blankly at us as we moved past. They were ghosts, living shadows of the people they once were, and I wondered how they could survive in such a place. What had they seen? What horrors had they endured while we were still miles away, safe and secure behind our lines? I wanted to look away, to ignore their suffering, but I couldn't. Their eyes followed me, accusing, pleading, and I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my chest. This was what awaited us. This was what Stalingrad had to offer. As we approached our assigned positions, I glanced back at the men. Their faces were set, determined, but I could see the uncertainty in their eyes. We had been through so much together, fought side by side in battles that had pushed us to our limits. But this felt different. There was an air of finality to it, a sense that this battle would be unlike any other. We had been trained to fight, to win, but nothing had prepared us for this. The sun was setting as we reached our staging area, casting long shadows across the city. The temperature dropped rapidly, the cold biting into my skin, even through my heavy coat. We huddled together for warmth, trying to find some comfort in the familiar routine of setting up camp. But there was no comfort to be found here, only the overwhelming sense of dread that grew with each passing moment. I lay on my thin bedroll that night, staring up at the sky through the gaps in the ruined ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come, my mind too full of thoughts of the battle to come, of the men beside me, of the city that loomed over us like a silent sentinel. The sounds of war were all around us: distant explosions, the crack of gunfire, the groan of tanks as they moved into position, and underneath it all, the steady, relentless thrum of the city itself, as if Stalingrad were alive, breathing, waiting for us to make our move. I closed my eyes, trying to block it all out, but the images kept coming. The shattered buildings, the hollow faces, the dark, icy river. I had been through hell before, but this was something else. This was a place where hope came to die, where men were swallowed whole by the city's hunger for destruction. As dawn broke, the city was shrouded in fog, the pale light casting an eerie glow over the ruins. We gathered our gear, our breath visible in the frigid air, and prepared to move out. No one spoke, there was nothing to say. We all knew what was coming, even if we couldn't put it into words. Stalingrad was waiting for us, and soon we would be swallowed by its flames. With one last look at the grey, lifeless horizon, I tightened my grip on my rifle and stepped into the abyss. The first time we engaged the Soviets in Stalingrad, I felt like I had stepped into a nightmare. The city, which had already felt oppressive and foreboding, suddenly came alive with the sounds of battle screams, explosions, and the staccato rattle of machine guns. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced, and it shook me to my core. We had been advancing cautiously through the ruins, our eyes scanning every shadow, every pile of rubble. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sounds the crunch of our boots on the broken pavement and the distant rumble of artillery. But we knew they were out there, the Soviets, hidden among the ruins, waiting for us to make our move. As we rounded a corner, we saw them. A group of Soviet soldiers, their faces hard and determined. Just as surprised to see us as we were to see them. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. Time itself stopped, and in that brief moment, I saw their eyes cold, calculating, filled with the same fear and resolve that I felt. And then, all hell broke loose. The crack of rifle fire shattered the silence, and I instinctively dropped to the ground, seeking cover behind a crumbling wall. The air was suddenly thick with dust and smoke, the smell of gunpowder burning my nose. I could hear the men around me shouting orders, calling out for cover, but it was all a blur, a chaotic cacophony that drowned out any sense of order. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear bullets whizzing past, the sharp ping as they ricocheted off the metal and stone around us. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to find a place to hide, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. "Return fire," someone shouted, and I snapped back to reality. I forced myself to raise my rifle, to peer over the edge of the wall. The Soviets were moving, ducking in and out of cover, their rifles trained on us. I pulled the trigger, felt the recoil slam into my shoulder, saw one of them fall. But there was no time to think about what I had done. More of them were coming, their faces set with grim determination, and I knew they wouldn't stop until we were all dead. The fighting was brutal, close quarters and unrelenting. The streets became a deadly maze, with danger lurking around every corner. We moved from building to building, clearing them room by room, but it was slow, painstaking work. The Soviets knew the city better than we did, and they used it to their advantage. Every time we thought we had gained ground, they would strike from the shadows, forcing us back. I lost track of time as the battle raged on. Minutes, hours, it all blended together in a haze of fear and adrenaline. I could feel the exhaustion creeping in, my muscles burning, my hands trembling as I reloaded my rifle again and again. But there was no time to rest, no time to think. It was kill or be killed, and I was determined to survive. At one point, we were pinned down in a narrow alley, the walls closing in on us as the Soviets poured fire from above. I remember the feeling of utter helplessness, the cold realization that we were trapped. I could see the men around me, some of them just boys, really terrified, their eyes wide with fear. I tried to push the fear down, to keep moving, to find a way out. But the enemy was relentless, and we were running out of options. Then, out of nowhere, there was a deafening explosion. The ground shook beneath us, and I was thrown against the wall, the air knocked from my lungs. I tasted blood, felt the sharp sting of shrapnel as it tore through my coat. For a moment, everything went black, and I thought I was dead. But then the world came rushing back, and I realized we had been hit by a Soviet grenade. The smoke cleared, and I saw them Soviet soldiers advancing through the rubble, their faces grim, rifles raised. I knew we couldn't hold them off. We were too few, too scattered. Panic gripped me, and I scrambled to my feet, desperate to find cover, to escape the onslaught. But there was nowhere to go. We were trapped, and I could feel the noose tightening around us. Just as I thought all was lost, a shout rang out from behind. Reinforcements. I turned to see a fresh wave of our men pouring into the alley, their guns blazing, cutting down the advancing Soviets. Relief washed over me, and I joined them, firing into the chaos, driving the enemy back. The tide had turned, and for the first time since the battle began, I felt a glimmer of hope. But it was short-lived. As the Soviets retreated, I looked around and saw the cost of our victory. The alley was littered with bodies, both ours and theirs. The ground was slick with blood, the air thick with the stench of death. I saw men I had known for months, men I had fought beside, lying lifeless in the dirt. The reality of war hit me then, harder than it ever had before. This wasn't just another battle. This was a slaughter. We regrouped, our numbers reduced, our spirits shattered. The city was still, the only sounds the distant rumble of artillery and the moans of the wounded. We had survived, but at what cost? Stalingrad had claimed its first victims, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. The battle had only just begun, and already it had taken so much from us. As night fell, we retreated to a makeshift shelter, a half-destroyed building that offered little protection from the cold. We sat in silence, huddled together for warmth, the horror of the day weighing heavy on our minds. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. We had all seen the same things, felt the same fear, and we all knew that tomorrow would bring more of the same. I lay down on the cold, hard floor, my body aching, my mind racing. Sleep wouldn't come, my thoughts a whirlwind of images, faces twisted in fear, bodies crumpling to the ground, the flash of gunfire in the dark. I tried to push it all away, to find some small measure of peace, but it was impossible. The battle had etched itself into my soul, and I knew I would never be the same. Stalingrad had shown us its teeth, and I was left with the terrifying realization that this was only the beginning. The city was a monster, a living nightmare, and we were trapped in its jaws. As I finally drifted into a restless sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all doomed. The city would consume us, one by one, until there was nothing left but the ruins and the echoes of our screams. The morning light filtered through the dense fog that clung to the ruins of Stalingrad, casting an eerie glow over the battered city. The air was cold and thick with the smell of smoke and decay. As we prepared to advance, I felt a mixture of determination and dread. We had been fighting for days, pushing through the city's twisted streets, but this was the next phase, moving deeper into the heart of the city where the Soviets were entrenched. Our orders were clear: advance through the industrial district and secure the eastern sector. It sounded simple enough, but in Stalingrad, nothing was simple. The buildings around us were skeletal remains of their former selves, their once grand facades now reduced to piles of rubble. The streets were narrow and twisted, choked with debris that turned every step into a potential trap. We moved cautiously, every sound magnified in the oppressive silence. I could see the men around me, their faces etched with exhaustion and grim determination. We had grown accustomed to the constant tension, to the fear that gripped us every time we rounded a corner or entered a new building. We were a mix of seasoned veterans and fresh recruits, each of us carrying our own burdens, our own fears. Our sergeant barked orders, his voice cutting through the cold air, and we fell into formation, ready to move out. The advance began slowly. The Soviets had turned every building into a fortress, every street into a killing zone. As we moved forward, the ground shook with the distant rumble of artillery, the sound echoing off the walls of the ruined buildings. The sky was a relentless gray, the sun obscured by the constant haze of smoke and dust. Visibility was poor, and every shadow could conceal an enemy. We entered a factory complex, its massive steel framework towering over us like a skeletal giant. The interior was a maze of rusted machinery and crumbling concrete. The smell of oil and burnt metal was overpowering, mingling with the acrid tang of gunpowder. Our footsteps echoed through the empty halls, each sound amplified in the stillness. We moved in pairs, checking every corner, every doorway, our rifles at the ready. The Soviets were adept at using the labyrinthine layout to their advantage, and we had to stay alert, every sense straining for the slightest sign of movement. As we progressed, the fighting intensified. The Soviets had dug in deep, and their resistance was fierce. We encountered pockets of enemy soldiers who fought with a desperation that matched our own. Each encounter was a brutal, chaotic clash, bullets flying, explosions tearing through the walls, the air filled with the deafening roar of battle. I remember one particular fight in a dilapidated office building. We had just breached the front entrance when a Soviet machine gun opened up from an upper floor. The rounds tore through the building, and I had to dive for cover, feeling the heat of the bullets as they passed close by. We took the building room by room, inch by inch. The walls were scarred with bullet holes, and the floors were littered with debris. In one room, I found a pair of Soviet soldiers huddled in a corner, their faces pale with fear. They surrendered quickly, their weapons dropped in a gesture of resignation. I felt a pang of sympathy, but there was no room for hesitation. The battle was relentless, and every moment of inaction could be fatal. As we pushed deeper into the factory, we encountered more resistance. The Soviets were determined, their fighting spirit unbroken, despite the heavy losses they were sustaining. We fought through a maze of narrow corridors and tight spaces, every step a battle against the city's twisted layout and the enemy's fierce defense. The constant noise of gunfire and explosions was overwhelming, the air thick with smoke and the stench of sweat and fear. In one particularly harrowing moment, we were caught in an ambush. As we advanced down a street, a series of explosions rocked the ground, sending shockwaves through our formation. The Soviets had rigged the buildings with explosives, and the detonations sent debris flying, creating a deadly hail of shrapnel. I remember the feeling of being thrown to the ground, the world spinning as the dust and smoke enveloped us. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and saw my comrades struggling to regroup amidst the chaos. The ambush had thrown us into disarray, but we managed to regain our footing. We pressed on, our progress slower now, each step measured and cautious. The advance had become a grueling test of endurance, our bodies pushed to their limits, our minds strained by the constant danger. The city seemed to be closing in around us, the walls pressing in, the narrow streets creating a feeling of claustrophobic confinement. Despite the hardships, we continued to push forward. The Soviets fought with a ferocity that was both admirable and terrifying. They used every trick in the book, snipers hidden in the wreckage, booby traps set to catch the unwary. We had to stay sharp, our senses honed to detect any sign of danger. Each building we took was a small victory, but the overall picture was grim. The city seemed endless, a labyrinth of destruction that stretched on as far as the eye could see. By late afternoon, we had reached the edge of the industrial district. The buildings here were more intact, though still heavily damaged. We had secured a small sector, but the victory felt hollow. The cost had been high, the casualties mounting. The city was unyielding, and our advance had come at a steep price. We set up a temporary perimeter and took what rest we could. The day's fighting had left us exhausted, our bodies aching from the relentless strain. As I lay down on the cold ground, my mind raced with the events of the day. The constant pressure, the unending battle, it was taking its toll. I tried to push the fear and fatigue aside, focusing on the task at hand. We had taken a step forward, but the fight was far from over. As night fell, the city was illuminated by the eerie glow of distant fires, the sky painted with the flicker of explosions. The sounds of battle continued in the distance, a reminder that Stalingrad was still very much alive. We had gained ground, but the price was steep, and the future remained uncertain. All we could do was brace ourselves for the next day, for the next battle, and hope that we could endure the nightmare that Stalingrad had become. In the darkness, I stared up at the sky, the stars barely visible through the smoke and haze. I thought about home, about the life I had left behind, and wondered if I would ever see it again. The city was a relentless beast, and we were its prey, struggling to survive in a place where hope seemed as distant as the stars above. The harsh light of dawn cut through the smoke and fog like a blade, revealing a landscape of ruin and desolation. Stalingrad had been a relentless adversary, each day a battle for survival amidst the shattered remnants of what once was a thriving city. But this day, this cold, grey day in early January 1943 felt different. There was a sense of foreboding, an undercurrent of change that we couldn't quite grasp, but could not ignore. Our unit had been entrenched in a sector of the city that was proving increasingly difficult to hold. The Soviets had been relentless in their counterattacks, each one more ferocious than the last. We were exhausted, our ranks thinned by the ceaseless fighting, our morale hanging by a thread. The city seemed to be conspiring against us, its twisted alleys and collapsed buildings creating a maze that swallowed both men and hope alike. As the morning sun struggled to pierce the thick layer of smoke, we received new orders to reinforce our positions and prepare for a major offensive. The instructions were vague, but the sense of urgency was palpable. We moved quickly, setting up defenses and consolidating our positions, all the while aware of the growing tension in the air. The day wore on, and the cold seemed to seep into our bones. The biting wind was relentless, making it difficult to focus on anything but the desire for warmth. Our hands were numb, our faces red and raw from the frigid temperatures. Despite the harsh conditions, we continued our preparations, knowing that something big was coming. Around midday, the first sign of what was to come appeared on the horizon, a plume of smoke rising in the distance, accompanied by the distant rumble of artillery. It was different from the usual skirmishes we had endured. This was a sustained, organized assault, and it was headed our way. The Soviets had been unusually quiet in the hours leading up to it, a silence that now felt ominous. The artillery barrage began with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city. Shells exploded with deafening roars, sending plumes of dirt and debris into the air. The ground trembled beneath us, and I felt a surge of adrenaline as I ducked for cover, the noise almost unbearable. The Soviet assault was well coordinated, their shells raining down on our positions with devastating accuracy. The once distant rumble was now a cacophony, a relentless barrage that seemed to target every weak point in our defenses. Our response was immediate. We manned our positions, firing back with everything we had. The Soviet artillery was relentless, but we had to hold the line. I crouched behind the remains of a wall, my rifle in hand, trying to find any glimpse of the enemy through the smoke and dust. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, and the constant explosions made it difficult to concentrate. In the midst of the chaos, something shifted. A new sound emerged, the unmistakable roar of tanks. Soviet tanks, advancing through the streets with menacing precision. Their guns roared, sending shells crashing into our positions, the explosions shaking the ground beneath us. We scrambled to adjust our defenses, trying to prepare for the onslaught. The tanks rolled forward, their heavy treads crushing everything in their path. We fired at them with all we had, but it felt like fighting a storm. The tanks were relentless, their armor nearly impervious to our weapons. The battle was becoming a desperate struggle for survival, each moment a fight against overwhelming odds. In the midst of the tank assault, I noticed a new movement in the distant Soviet infantry advancing behind the armor. They were coming in waves, their figures emerging from the smoke like specters. The sheer scale of the attack was staggering. It was as if the Soviets had unleashed every resource they had, a final, decisive push to break our hold on the city. As the enemy forces closed in, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't experienced in a long time: fear. The situation was spiraling out of control, and I could see the same fear in the faces of my comrades. We were being overwhelmed, and it was clear that the Soviets were not going to stop until we were driven from the city. Just when it seemed like all was lost, the tide of battle shifted once again. Our reinforcements arrived, fresh troops, along with a new wave of artillery and armored vehicles. It was a lifeline in the midst of chaos. We quickly coordinated with the new arrivals, reinforcing our positions and launching a counterattack. The Soviets, taken aback by the sudden shift, faltered momentarily. The new artillery barrage was intense, the shells raining down on the Soviet positions with a vengeance. Our tanks joined the fray, their guns thundering as they engaged the Soviet armor. The battle became a fierce, back-and-forth struggle, the momentum swinging from one side to the other. It was a grueling, exhausting fight, but we managed to push the Soviets back, reclaiming some of the ground we had lost. By late afternoon, the immediate threat had been quelled, though the fighting was far from over. The city was a smoldering battlefield, the air thick with smoke and the stench of destruction. The once crisp winter air was now filled with the haze of battle, the sky darkened by the smoke of burning buildings. As the day drew to a close, we took stock of the situation. The casualties were heavy, both among our ranks and the enemy's. The city lay in ruins, a testament to the ferocity of the day's fighting. The turning point had come, but at a steep cost. We had held our ground, but the price of victory was evident in the shattered landscape and the fallen men around us. In the aftermath, as night fell over Stalingrad, the sense of change was palpable. The battle had shifted, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was a glimmer of hope. The Soviets had thrown everything they had at us, and while we had managed to repel their assault, we knew that the fight was far from over. The city was still a battleground, its twisted streets and crumbling buildings a constant reminder of the brutal conflict we were embroiled in. As I sat amidst the wreckage, trying to catch my breath and tend to my wounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The battle for Stalingrad had reached a critical juncture, and the outcome was still uncertain. But for now, we had survived, and that was a victory in itself. The first whisper of trouble came through in the form of rumors, vague, unsettling murmurs that spread through our ranks like wildfire. We were to hold our positions, fortify our defenses, but the sense of unease was growing, palpable in the heavy air of Stalingrad. The city had been a relentless adversary, and now it seemed to conspire with the Soviets in a new, more sinister way. We were about to discover just how dire our situation had become. The early days of January had brought with them a biting cold that seeped into our bones, but the real chill was the mounting anxiety that something was fundamentally shifting. The Soviets had been pushing hard, but now their attacks seemed more coordinated, more intense. Our supplies were running low, and the reinforcement lines were growing thinner with each passing day. The encirclement began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Small groups of Soviet troops, heavily armed and determined, began to appear in the areas around our positions. At first, they were just occasional skirmishes, small probing attacks that seemed manageable. But these attacks became more frequent, more aggressive. It was as if the Soviets were testing our defenses, probing for weaknesses. On January 16th, the situation took a turn for the worse. The weather had turned even colder, and a biting wind swept through the city, carrying with it the smell of smoke and destruction. The Soviets had launched a massive offensive, their artillery pounding our positions with relentless fury. The air was filled with the roar of explosions and the scream of incoming shells. As the day wore on, it became clear that the Soviets were not merely probing, they were encircling us. The enemy was tightening its grip, pushing in from all directions, cutting off our lines of communication and supply. Our once secure positions were becoming isolated, surrounded by a sea of Soviet troops and machinery. The realization of encirclement hit hard. It wasn't just a tactical maneuver, it was a death knell. We were cut off from the outside world, trapped in a city that seemed to grow more hostile by the hour. Our food and ammunition supplies were dwindling, and the constant fighting was taking its toll. Morale was plummeting, and the sense of isolation was almost unbearable. We fought desperately to maintain our foothold, but every advance the Soviets made felt like a tightening noose. They had dug in, using every building and street as a fortified position. We could hear the distant rumble of Soviet tanks and the crackle of machine gun fire as they consolidated their hold around us. Our once confident movements were now cautious and deliberate, each step a struggle against the encroaching enemy. The Soviet strategy was clear: isolate and starve us into submission. They cut off our supply routes, the flow of food and ammunition dwindling to a trickle. The once plentiful resources were now a distant memory, and we were forced to ration what little we had. Our situation grew more desperate by the hour. On January 21st, the full extent of the encirclement became apparent. We received a brief message from headquarters, confirming our worst fears: we were completely surrounded. The Soviets had achieved their objective, and we were now trapped within the city, with no hope of reinforcement or resupply. The psychological impact of the encirclement was as devastating as the physical toll. We were cut off from the outside world, isolated in a city that had become a prison. The cold was relentless, the hunger gnawing at our insides. We huddled together in makeshift shelters, the buildings around us reduced to rubble and ruin. The once proud buildings of Stalingrad were now just another part of the bleak, unforgiving landscape. The encirclement brought with it a new level of desperation. We were forced to rely on whatever we could scavenge from the ruins, our once pristine equipment now battered and improvised. The fighting continued, but now it was a grim struggle for survival. The Soviets were unrelenting, their attacks becoming more frequent, more brutal. Every day was a battle against the elements as much as the enemy. The cold seeped through our clothing, numbing our fingers and toes. The wind howled through the wreckage, carrying with it the cries of the wounded and the sound of distant artillery. Our once strong defenses were now a series of makeshift barricades, barely holding against the relentless assault. By late January, the situation had become critical. We were living in a state of constant tension, the threat of Soviet attack ever present. The city was a labyrinth of destruction, each street and building a potential trap. We fought to hold our positions, but every day felt like a step closer to the end. The encirclement had us in its grip, and escape seemed increasingly unlikely. The psychological strain was immense. We were isolated, cut off from the outside world, and our once familiar surroundings had become alien and hostile. The constant pressure of the Soviet offensive, combined with the harsh winter conditions, created a sense of dread that was impossible to ignore. Every corner held the potential for an enemy ambush, every shadow a possible threat. As the days dragged on, the reality of our situation settled in. The encirclement was more than just a tactical maneuver. It was a prison that held us captive in a city that had become our graveyard. We were fighting not just for victory, but for survival, each moment a struggle against the encroaching enemy and the unforgiving environment. The encirclement of Stalingrad was a turning point, a grim reality that underscored the desperation of our situation. We were trapped in a city that seemed to be closing in around us, our fate increasingly uncertain. The once great battle for Stalingrad had become a fight for survival, and we were caught in its merciless grip. The winter of Stalingrad was a relentless force, a harsh, unyielding beast that seemed to take on a life of its own. The cold was not just a mere inconvenience, but a constant, brutal presence that gnawed at our very souls. Each day brought new challenges, as the city's ruins and the freezing temperatures combined to create an environment of unimaginable hardship. By late January, the city was buried under a blanket of snow and ice. The once barren streets were now slick with frost, and every movement was a battle against the freezing cold. The snow fell relentlessly, a constant, silent assault that added to the desolation of the city. The biting wind howled through the skeletal remains of buildings, carrying with it the icy fingers of winter that seemed to penetrate our very bones. The cold was all-encompassing. It seeped into our clothing, numbing our fingers and toes, making even the simplest tasks a struggle. Our breaths formed clouds of mist in the frigid air, and every exhalation seemed to freeze before our eyes. The once innocuous sound of our boots crunching through the snow was now a constant reminder of the cold that surrounded us. We had long since run out of proper winter gear. Our uniforms were tattered and threadbare, offering little protection against the biting wind. Many of us were forced to improvise, using whatever materials we could find to create makeshift layers of warmth. Old blankets, scraps of cloth, and even parts of uniforms from fallen comrades were fashioned into makeshift garments, though they provided only minimal relief. The lack of proper shelter only exacerbated the situation. Our makeshift bunkers and defensive positions were hastily constructed from the rubble of the city, providing little protection from the elements. The buildings around us, once sturdy and imposing, were now hollowed-out shells, their interiors filled with snow and ice. We huddled together for warmth, our bodies pressed close in an attempt to stave off the cold, but the chill was unrelenting. Food was scarce, and what little we had was often barely edible. Our rations were dwindling, and the constant fight for survival left little room for comfort or luxury. We scavenged what we could from the ruins of the city, but supplies were running low. The hunger was a constant gnawing presence, exacerbated by the cold that seemed to intensify our cravings. Despite the hardships, we continued to fight. The Soviets were unyielding, their attacks becoming even more vicious as the temperature dropped. The battles were now fought in the freezing snow, our rifles and ammunition often rendered unreliable by the harsh conditions. We were forced to adapt, using every resource at our disposal to hold our ground. The enemy seemed to take advantage of the winter weather, their movements becoming more aggressive as they sought to capitalize on our weakened state. The cold also had a profound impact on our morale. The isolation, the hunger, and the constant exposure to the elements created a sense of despair that was difficult to shake. We had once been a proud, confident force, but the endless winter seemed to strip us of our resolve. The once vivid camaraderie was now overshadowed by a pervasive sense of futility. Each day felt like a battle against not just the enemy, but the very elements themselves. The winter nights were the worst. As darkness fell, the temperatures plummeted even further, and the wind howled through the city with a ferocity that seemed almost alive. We would gather around small fires, trying to warm our hands and feet, but the flames barely made a dent in the cold. The warmth was fleeting, a brief respite before the bitter chill set in once more. In the midst of this struggle, the city itself seemed to become a reflection of our own suffering. The once bustling streets were now a wasteland of snow and ice, the buildings reduced to skeletal frames. The occasional explosion or burst of gunfire was a stark reminder that the battle raged on, but the winter weather added a layer of grimness to the conflict. The city was a frozen hell, and we were trapped in its icy grip. On February 2nd, the culmination of the Soviet offensive became apparent. The encirclement was complete, and the noose around us tightened with every passing hour. The Soviets launched a final, decisive push, their attacks relentless and brutal. The cold seemed to amplify the intensity of the fighting, each clash more desperate than the last. Our defenses were pushed to the limit, and the struggle to hold our ground became a battle against the combined forces of the enemy and the winter. In the midst of the chaos, we fought with everything we had left. The cold had drained much of our strength, but there was a fierce determination in our eyes. We knew that survival was becoming increasingly unlikely, but we refused to surrender without a fight. Each man fought with a desperation born of both the need to survive and the knowledge of what awaited us if we failed. As the day wore on, it became clear that the winter had become more than just an adversary. It was a weapon wielded against us, a force that seemed to conspire with the Soviets to ensure our defeat. The combination of the encircling enemy and the unrelenting cold created a situation that was nearly insurmountable. We were trapped in a frozen wasteland, our fate sealed by the harshest of winters. In the end, the winter's grip was more than just a physical challenge. It was a test of endurance and resolve. The cold was a constant reminder of our precarious situation. a harsh reality that overshadowed every aspect of our existence. The battle for Stalingrad had become a struggle, not just for victory, but for survival in the most unforgiving of conditions. Isolation in Stalingrad was a different kind of warfare, subtle, insidious, and psychological. It wasn't just the physical barriers created by the Soviet encirclement or the unrelenting winter, it was the creeping sense of abandonment, the feeling of being cut off from the world, that gnawed at our spirits and eroded our resolve. By February, the reality of our isolation had become undeniable. The Soviets had effectively sealed us off from any outside support. Our supply lines were severed, our communications with the outside world cut off. The city had become a fortress of solitude, a prison where every sound and shadow contributed to a growing sense of despair. The first signs of our isolation were small but telling. The radio silence from headquarters grew longer, the messages more infrequent and disjointed. We were cut off from any news of the outside world, left to piece together information from the sporadic and often distorted signals that occasionally broke through the static. Each brief transmission was a fragile thread connecting us to a reality that seemed increasingly distant. We began to realize that the city itself was becoming a prison. The once familiar streets, now coated with ice and snow, had turned into a maze of desolation. Buildings that had once served as landmarks or shelters were now just empty shells, their interiors filled with debris and the cold whisper of abandonment. The sense of being lost in a vast, frozen wasteland was overwhelming, every street and ruin blending into the next in an endless, disorienting expanse. The emotional toll of isolation was immense. The absence of contact with loved ones, the severance from any semblance of normal life, created a pervasive sense of loneliness. We were soldiers, used to camaraderie and a sense of purpose, but now that purpose seemed distant and elusive. The battle had become more than just a fight against the enemy, it was a fight against the loneliness that wrapped around us like a suffocating shroud. In the absence of communication, rumors began to flourish. The uncertainty of our situation led to wild speculation and misinformation. We heard stories of potential relief forces, of rescue missions that never materialized, of secret plans and conspiracies that only served to heighten our sense of dread. Each new rumor was a fleeting hope quickly dashed by the harsh reality of our situation. The psychological impact of isolation was compounded by the physical deprivation. The constant cold was an ever-present torment, but the hunger was equally brutal. Our rations were woefully inadequate, and scavenging for food in the frozen ruins was a grim and often futile task. The hunger gnawed at our bodies and minds, amplifying the sense of isolation as we struggled to keep our strength up in an environment that offered little in the way of comfort or sustenance. The days blurred together, marked only by the changing light of dawn and dusk and the unceasing noise of battle. Each day seemed like a repetition of the last, a monotonous cycle of fighting, freezing, and yearning for something more. The isolation created a sense of timelessness, where the passage of hours and days was meaningless compared to the ever-present struggle to survive. Our defenses were a patchwork of makeshift fortifications and hastily constructed barricades. The once effective strategies and tactics seemed increasingly inadequate in the face of the relentless Soviet pressure. The constant state of readiness, the ever-present fear of attack, and the dwindling resources all contributed to a sense of perpetual crisis. Even our relationships with one another began to fray. The isolation created a rift in our camaraderie, as the pressure and stress of our situation took a toll on our interactions. Discontent and fear bred mistrust and paranoia, making it difficult to maintain the cohesion and unity that had once been our strength. The bonds that had held us together began to unravel under the strain of isolation, leaving us more vulnerable to both internal and external threats. One particularly harrowing evening, as the wind howled through the city and the cold bit through every layer of clothing, we experienced a brief, glimmering hope of contact. A signal flare went up, a desperate attempt to reach out for help or signal our position. For a brief moment, the flare illuminated the desolate landscape, casting eerie shadows across the ruins. we waited with bated breath, hoping against hope that someone, anyone, might see it and come to our aid. But as the flare faded, so did our hope, leaving us with nothing but the cold and the silence of the city. As February dragged on, the reality of our isolation became an inescapable fact. The Soviet forces outside continued their relentless pressure, their tactics designed to exploit our weakness and isolation. Each day was a test of endurance, a struggle to maintain our resolve in the face of overwhelming odds and the unrelenting solitude. The isolation was more than just a physical state, it was a psychological battlefield. The absence of contact with the outside world, the constant cold, and the dwindling supplies all combined to create an environment of unrelenting hardship. It was a test of not just our physical strength, but our mental and emotional fortitude. In the midst of this struggle, we clung to what little hope remained. We continued to fight, to hold our positions, even as the isolation seemed to tighten its grip. The battle for Stalingrad had become a fight not just for survival, but for the very essence of our humanity. In the frozen wasteland of isolation, we struggled to hold on to our sense of purpose and identity, even as the city and the winter sought to strip them away. The isolation was a harsh reality, a constant reminder of our precarious situation. It was a force that tested us in ways we had never imagined, pushing us to our limits and beyond. In the end, it was a battle against the very essence of solitude and despair, a fight to maintain our spirit in the face of overwhelming isolation. Desperation is a shadow that creeps in slowly, subtly tightening its grip until it consumes everything in its path. By early February, as Stalingrad lay encased in its frozen prison, desperation had become an ever-present force among us. It wasn't merely about the external pressures of battle and isolation, it was an internal collapse, a gnawing emptiness that turned our fight for survival into a frantic scramble against the inevitable. The conditions were unforgiving. The cold had intensified, the city's infrastructure had deteriorated further, and our supplies had dwindled to dangerous levels. Each day, the struggle to obtain even the most basic necessities became more desperate. Food had become a rare commodity, with our rations reduced to mere scraps. We were forced to ration what little we had, a grim game of survival where each crumb was a small victory against hunger. Scavenging for food became a daily ordeal. We ventured into the ruins of Stalingrad, navigating the treacherous terrain of snow and ice. The once sturdy buildings were now hollow shells, their interiors filled with debris and decay. Searching for food was not just a physical challenge but a psychological one. Each broken-down structure was a potential source of nourishment or a dead end. We rummaged through the wreckage, digging through layers of snow and rubble, our hopes often dashed by empty cupboards and abandoned stores. Our desperation extended beyond food. Medical supplies were virtually non-existent, and injuries and illnesses were rampant. The cold had taken its toll on our bodies, and frostbite and hypothermia became frequent afflictions. The few medics among us struggled to provide care with meager supplies. Every minor injury had the potential to become a major issue, and the lack of proper medical treatment only amplified the sense of dread. As our situation worsened, morale plummeted. The psychological toll of our dire circumstances began to unravel the once sturdy resolve of our unit. The constant cold, the gnawing hunger, and the ceaseless pressure of the Soviet offensive created an environment of pervasive despair. The camaraderie that had once bolstered our spirits began to fray under the strain. Fractures appeared in our relationships as the stress and deprivation turned us against each other. Mistrust and suspicion grew, further isolating us in our already dire situation. The Soviets, aware of our vulnerability, intensified their efforts. Their attacks were now not just military offensives but psychological assaults. They used loudspeakers to broadcast propaganda, amplifying our sense of isolation and desperation. Their tactics were designed to demoralize us, to play on our fears and break our will to fight. The constant bombardment, both physical and psychological, added another layer to our growing sense of helplessness. One particularly bleak night, as we huddled in our makeshift shelters, we received an unexpected message from what was left of our command structure. It was brief and grim, confirming that reinforcements were unlikely and that we should prepare for a prolonged siege. The reality of our situation hit hard. The message made it clear that our isolation was not just a temporary inconvenience, but a long-term condition we would have to endure. Desperation drove some to take extreme measures. A few of our men, unable to bear the constant strain, attempted to break through the Soviet lines in a desperate bid for freedom. They were driven by a mix of hope and hopelessness, seeking any escape from the nightmare that had become our daily reality. These attempts were tragic and futile, often resulting in casualties that only added to the mounting sense of despair among us. In the midst of this turmoil, we continued to fight. The desperation fueled a fierce determination to hold our positions, even as the odds seemed increasingly insurmountable. Each battle was a desperate struggle, a fight not just for survival but for a sense of control in a situation that felt utterly chaotic. Our defenses were often improvised, relying on whatever materials we could salvage from the ruins. Every barricade, every fortification was a testament to our unwillingness to give up, even as the odds stacked against us. As the days wore on, the sheer weight of desperation became almost unbearable. We were trapped in a city that seemed to be collapsing around us, with no hope of escape or relief. The once familiar landmarks were now unrecognizable, reduced to rubble and desolation. The constant fighting, the unending cold, and the ever-present hunger created a sense of apocalyptic bleakness. Desperation, in its rawest form, was a suffocating force. It eroded our strength, wore down our resolve, and tested our humanity. In the face of overwhelming adversity, we clung to the hope that somehow, somewhere, a change might come. Each small victory, a single meal, a brief respite from the cold became a lifeline, a momentary escape from the crushing weight of our situation. The battle for Stalingrad had become a fight against more than just the enemy. It was a battle against the desperation that threatened to engulf us. Each day was a test of endurance, a struggle to maintain our will to survive in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The city was a crucible of suffering, and we were caught in its relentless grip, fighting not just for victory, but for the very essence of hope and humanity amidst the despair. The end was nearing, an inevitability etched into every frozen ruin and every shivering soul. The final days in Stalingrad were a relentless cascade of cold, violence, and unyielding resolve. It was a grim symphony of survival, each note a desperate clash between hope and despair. By mid-February, the reality of our situation had crystallized into a grim certainty. The Soviet forces were tightening their grip, their offensive relentless and unceasing. We were cornered, our once proud defenses now strained to their breaking point. The encirclement had become more than just a tactical maneuver. It was a stranglehold that seemed to squeeze the very life out of us. The weather was an unrelenting adversary. The temperature continued to plummet, making every movement a battle against the cold. The wind howled through the city, its icy breath penetrating our layers of clothing and numbing our extremities. The once familiar streets were now treacherous ice-covered paths, every step a precarious struggle to avoid slipping and falling. Food was a distant memory, and our dwindling supplies had reached critical levels. We scavenged what we could from the ruins, but it was never enough. The hunger gnawed at our insides, a constant reminder of our desperate state. Our meager rations had become so scarce that they were reserved only for the most essential moments of energy, the bare minimum needed to keep us functioning. As the Soviet forces pressed in, their tactics became increasingly brutal. They employed a relentless barrage of artillery and mortar fire, their shells crashing into our positions with a deafening roar. The explosions shattered the fragile remnants of our defenses, sending debris and smoke swirling through the air. Every blast felt like a physical blow, a brutal reminder of the crushing weight of our predicament. Despite the overwhelming odds, we fought with a fierce determination. Our positions, though improvised and crumbling, were held with a tenacity born of desperation and defiance. Each building, each barricade became a stronghold, a symbol of our unwillingness to surrender. The fighting was now close quarters, the ruins of the city providing a grim but effective battleground. We engaged in fierce skirmishes, our weapons barely functioning in the cold and our movements sluggish from exhaustion. On February 2nd, the Soviet forces launched their final, all-out assault. It was a coordinated offensive, a massive push designed to break through our last lines of defense. The city erupted into chaos, the noise of battle deafening as Soviet tanks and infantry pressed forward with unrelenting force. Their advance was a tidal wave of steel and fire, overwhelming our beleaguered positions. Our final stand was a desperate, frantic affair. The Soviets attacked from all directions, their soldiers moving with grim determination. Our defensive lines were overrun, our positions crumbling under the sheer weight of the assault. The once sturdy barricades were reduced to rubble, and our defenses were pushed to their limits. In the midst of the chaos, we fought with everything we had left. Our ammunition was dwindling, our strength fading, but the fight continued with a raw, primal intensity. The close-quarters combat was brutal, every inch of ground contested with ferocious determination. The city was a labyrinth of destruction, each street and building a potential battlefield. The final hours of our resistance were a blur of violence and desperation. The Soviets pressed in from all sides, their numbers overwhelming. The buildings around us were reduced to smoking ruins, the air filled with the acrid stench of gunpowder and burning debris. The constant barrage of Soviet artillery shattered any semblance of order, turning the city into a chaotic, hellish landscape. As the day wore on, it became clear that the end was imminent. Our positions were overrun, and the Soviet forces began to encircle the US even more tightly. The fighting was now a series of desperate last stands, each moment a struggle to hold onto a piece of ground, each man fighting with a fierce, final determination. The final stand was marked by a grim sense of inevitability. The Soviet forces, relentless and overpowering, advanced with a cold efficiency. The remnants of our unit fought valiantly, but the odds were insurmountable. Each wave of Soviet soldiers seemed to close in on us, their numbers overwhelming, their firepower relentless. As the sun began to set on February 2nd, the fighting grew even more desperate. The city, once a battleground of defiance, had become a graveyard of shattered dreams. Our final positions were a grim testament to our struggle, the last stand of a unit caught in the relentless vise of Soviet encirclement. With the encroaching darkness came the realization that our resistance was nearing its end. The Soviet forces had effectively broken through our last defenses, and the finality of our situation was clear. The city, once a symbol of our defiance, had become a tomb of despair. In the final moments, there was no surrender, only a grim acceptance of the inevitable. We fought to the last, each man holding his ground with a fierce resolve. The final stand was a testament to our unwillingness to give up, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As the last echoes of battle faded into the night, the city was left in a silence that spoke of the end. The final stand of our unit was a somber chapter in the story of Stalingrad, a testament to the courage and desperation of those who fought to the last breath in a city that had become a crucible of suffering and survival. The moment of surrender came like the quiet after a storm, sudden, overwhelming, and laden with a heavy, suffocating finality. After days of relentless fighting, the city had fallen silent, save for the distant echoes of Soviet troops moving through the rubble. The long battle, marked by desperate skirmishes and grim defiance, had finally reached its end. The news of our surrender was not a sudden proclamation, but rather a gradual realization that seeped into the very fabric of our being. It began with the soft murmur of Soviet troops advancing through the city, their presence now a constant, oppressive reality. The fighting had ceased, replaced by an eerie calm that felt almost unreal after the cacophony of battle. The order to surrender came through our remaining communication channels, its tone devoid of the brash confidence that had characterized earlier messages. It was somber, almost resigned, and it carried the weight of defeat. We were instructed to lay down our arms and prepare for the inevitable. The decision to surrender was not made in haste. It came after agonizing days of dwindling resources and mounting casualties. Our once proud defenses had crumbled under the relentless pressure of the Soviet onslaught, and our capacity to continue fighting was rapidly diminishing. The reality of our situation had become starkly apparent. The encirclement was complete, our supply lines severed, and our numbers reduced to a fraction of what they had been. The surrender process was a surreal experience. As the final order was given, we gathered in what remained of our positions, the remnants of our defenses barely recognizable amidst the wreckage. The once formidable barricades were now reduced to heaps of debris, and the buildings around us were little more than skeletal frames. The Soviets, having secured their victory, began to emerge from their positions, their presence now an unmistakable reality. Their soldiers, clad in the drab winter uniforms and bearing the weight of their own struggles, moved through the city with a grim determination. There was no celebration in their advance, only a cold efficiency that spoke of a war that had claimed far too many lives. As we prepared to surrender, there was a profound sense of resignation among us. We had fought to the last, but the reality of our situation had become undeniable. The city, once a battleground of fierce resistance, was now a graveyard of shattered hopes and dreams. The surrender was a final, reluctant acknowledgement of our defeat. The process of laying down our arms was conducted with a sense of weary acceptance. We emerged from our positions, our weapons surrendered, our uniforms tattered and worn. The Soviets, their expressions guarded, directed us to assemble in a designated area. The cold wind cut through our already frail bodies, a final reminder of the harsh conditions we had endured. In the aftermath of surrender, there was a profound silence that settled over the city. The battle had left its mark on every corner, the ruins a testament to the fierce struggle that had taken place. The city was now a landscape of devastation, a haunting reminder of the cost of the conflict. The Soviet troops began the process of sorting through the prisoners, their movements methodical and impersonal. We were processed with a mix of bureaucratic efficiency and cold detachment. The reality of our new status as prisoners of war began to sink in, the full weight of our defeat pressing heavily upon us. The conditions of captivity were harsh, but they were not unexpected. We were herded into makeshift camps, the buildings that had once served as shelters now repurposed for our confinement. The cold, which had been a constant adversary in the final days of battle, continued to gnaw at us, making the transition from combat to captivity a grim affair. In the days following our surrender, we faced the stark reality of our situation. The Soviets, having secured their victory, began the process of establishing control over the city. For us, the focus shifted from the fight for survival to the harsh reality of captivity. The transition was marked by a profound sense of loss, not just of the battle, but of our autonomy and our hopes for the future. The city, once a symbol of our defiance, had become a place of subdued resignation. The once bustling streets were now filled with the sounds of Soviet troops and the occasional murmur of conversation among the prisoners. The remnants of our resistance were slowly being dismantled, the final vestiges of our struggle giving way to the reality of our new circumstances. In the quiet moments, when the sounds of the city and the Soviet forces receded, there was a profound sense of reflection. We had fought with everything we had, but the surrender marked the end of our journey in Stalingrad. The battle, with all its trials and tribulations, had reached its conclusion, and we were left to grapple with the reality of our defeat. The surrender was a somber end to a grueling chapter, a final acknowledgement of the cost of the battle. As the city fell into a new, uneasy peace, we were left to confront the aftermath, the weight of our defeat heavy upon us. The surrender was not just a formal end to the battle, but a profound moment of reckoning, marking the conclusion of a struggle that had defined our existence in Stalingrad. Captivity was a harsh new reality, a world far removed from the chaos and defiance of battle. It was a transition from the frenzied fight for survival to a grim routine of confinement and deprivation. The shift from soldiers to prisoners of war was marked by a profound sense of loss and a stark confrontation with a new, unyielding reality. Our first moments as captives were disorienting. The once familiar streets of Stalingrad, now stark and desolate, became the backdrop for our new existence. The Soviets, with their stern faces and pragmatic approach, managed the transition with a mixture of detachment and practicality. Their demeanor offered little comfort, as they focused on the task of organizing and managing the influx of prisoners. We were marched to a makeshift prison camp, a collection of hastily erected structures and repurposed buildings that had once served other purposes. The camp was situated on the outskirts of the city, far from the former front line, but close enough to feel the lingering chill of the battle. The ground was frozen solid, a relentless reminder of the harsh winter conditions that continued to grip the city. The camp itself was a grim testament to the realities of wartime captivity. Barbed wire fences encircled the area, creating a stark barrier between us and the outside world. Guard towers, manned by Soviet soldiers with watchful eyes, loomed over the camp, ensuring that any thoughts of escape were quickly extinguished. The camp was surrounded by a moat-like ditch, adding an additional layer of security to our confinement. The initial days in captivity were marked by a profound sense of uncertainty. We were processed in a hurried, impersonal manner. Identification numbers were assigned, and personal belongings were confiscated. Our uniforms, once symbols of our identity and purpose, were stripped away, replaced with the drab, ill-fitting clothes of a prisoner. The loss of our uniforms was not just a physical change, but a symbolic one, stripping us of the last remnants of our former lives. Living conditions in the camp were harsh and unforgiving. The barracks, constructed from wood and metal, were rudimentary and poorly insulated against the cold. The interior was sparse, with only the barest essentials provided. Wooden bunks, stacked 3 high, were our new beds. Each bunk was equipped with a thin straw mattress, offering little comfort against the cold and hard wood beneath. The space was cramped, with barely enough room for each man to stretch out. The camp's communal facilities were equally austere. The latrines, located at one end of the camp, were rudimentary and lacked privacy. The water supply was limited, and the sanitation facilities were inadequate, leading to a constant struggle to maintain cleanliness and hygiene. The lack of proper facilities exacerbated the already grim conditions, leading to an environment where illness and disease spread rapidly. Food was a constant issue. The rations we received were minimal and often of poor quality. The meals, served in thin, metal bowls, consisted of meager portions of bland, unappetizing fare. We received a thin soup, a small piece of bread, and occasionally a portion of gruel or stewed meat. The food was insufficient to meet our nutritional needs, and hunger became a constant companion. The harsh conditions were compounded by the psychological impact of captivity. The loss of freedom, the constant surveillance, and the uncertainty of our future created an environment of profound stress and anxiety. The camp became a place where hope was a rare commodity, and the days blended into one another in a monotonous cycle of survival. Despite the dire circumstances, there were small moments of camaraderie among the prisoners. Shared experiences of hardship and the common struggle for survival created bonds that transcended our previous differences. In conversations in the barracks, though subdued, became a source of solace and solidarity. We exchanged stories, shared resources, and supported one another in the face of the overwhelming challenges. The Soviet guards, while strict, were not always overtly hostile. Their treatment of us varied, with some showing a degree of indifference and others displaying a more authoritarian demeanor. The guards were a constant presence, their eyes ever watchful as they patrolled the camp and ensured that the rules were enforced. The interactions between prisoners and guards were limited, and any sign of dissent was quickly suppressed. The camp routine was monotonous and controlled. We were subjected to regular roll calls and inspections, and any infractions were met with swift, often harsh, punishment. The daily schedule was rigid, with little room for deviation. Our days were structured around meal times, work assignments, and mandatory roll calls, with the occasional break for rest. Work assignments were a central part of camp life. We were required to perform various tasks, often in harsh conditions and with minimal supervision. The work was laborious and provided little respite from the physical and psychological strain of captivity. Tasks ranged from manual labor, such as clearing debris or maintaining the camp infrastructure, to more mundane chores like cleaning and organizing. As the days turned into weeks, the reality of our captivity settled in. The city of Stalingrad, once a symbol of our defiance and struggle, was now a distant memory. The camp became our world, and the harsh routine of captivity became the new normal. The struggle to maintain hope and dignity in the face of such adversity was a constant battle. Captivity was a crucible of suffering and endurance. It was a stark reminder of the price of conflict and the profound challenges faced by those who find themselves on the wrong side of victory. Each day in the camp was a test of resilience, a struggle to retain a sense of self amidst the harsh realities of imprisonment. In the end, captivity was a relentless reminder of our vulnerability and the harsh consequences of war. It was a world where survival took precedence over all else, and where the simple act of enduring became a testament to the strength of the human spirit. The camp was a place of profound hardship, but also a place where the will to survive and the hope for a better future endured, even amidst the bleakest of circumstances. The transition from the relative order of a prisoner of war camp to the grim reality of a Soviet gulag was jarring and profound. It was a shift from the relative confinement of the camp to the harsh, dehumanizing world of forced labor and relentless punishment. The gulag was not merely a place of imprisonment, it was a place where the human spirit was tested against the cruelest of adversities. We were transported from Stalingrad under a heavy guard, our movements restricted by the cold and the ever-watchful eyes of Soviet soldiers. The journey was long and arduous, marked by the same winter bleakness that had characterized our time in the city. The convoy of trucks and open freight cars, packed with prisoners, rumbled over snow-covered roads and through icy landscapes, each mile taking us further from the battlefield and deeper into the heart of the Soviet prison system. Upon arrival, the gulag revealed itself as a harsh and unforgiving landscape. The camp was located in a remote, desolate area, surrounded by dense, snow-covered forests and rugged terrain. The isolation was absolute, with no sign of civilization for miles around. The buildings were sparse and functional, constructed from wood and metal, and designed to withstand the harsh weather rather than provide comfort. The gulag complex consisted of several barracks, each housing hundreds of prisoners. These barracks were rudimentary, with wooden walls and thin metal roofs that offered minimal protection from the biting cold. Inside, the space was divided into narrow bunks, stacked 3 high. Each bunk was equipped with a thin straw mattress, which provided little insulation against the frigid temperatures. The daily routine in the gulag was grueling and relentless. We awoke before dawn, roused by the harsh clamor of guards and the frigid air that seeped through the thin walls of our barracks. The mornings were spent in a hasty, disorganized breakfast line where we were given meager portions of gruel and a small piece of bread. The food was barely edible, consisting of a thin, watery soup and sometimes a small serving of stewed meat or vegetables. It was insufficient to sustain us, and hunger quickly became a constant companion. After breakfast, we were assigned to various work details. The labor was exhausting and often performed in brutal conditions. We were tasked with clearing land, logging timber, or maintaining the camp's infrastructure. The work was physically demanding and conducted under harsh supervision. The cold was relentless, and the labor often involved long hours in temperatures that plunged well below freezing. The guards were a constant presence, their demeanor ranging from indifferent to openly hostile. They enforced the rules with a rigid and often arbitrary authority. Discipline was harsh, and any infraction, real or perceived, was met with severe punishment. The guards wielded their power with a cruel efficiency, and the constant threat of violence created an atmosphere of fear and submission. The conditions in the gulag were a severe test of endurance. The cold was a pervasive force, making every task a battle against the elements. We wore tattered, ill-fitting uniforms that provided little protection against the winter's bite. The inadequate clothing, combined with the relentless exposure to the cold, led to widespread suffering from frostbite and hypothermia. The camp's sanitation facilities were primitive at best. The latrines were a series of rudimentary holes in the ground, separated from the living quarters by only a thin wooden partition. Cleanliness was a constant struggle, and the lack of proper facilities contributed to the spread of disease. Illnesses, such as dysentery and tuberculosis, were common, and medical care was rudimentary and often unavailable. The psychological toll of life in the Gulag was as severe as the physical conditions. The isolation and harsh treatment wore down our spirits, and the sense of hopelessness was pervasive. The Gulag was a place where despair and dehumanization were constant companions. The camaraderie that had once sustained us in battle was now a fragile, fleeting comfort amidst the relentless harshness of captivity. Despite the brutal conditions, small acts of solidarity and resistance emerged among the prisoners. Shared experiences and the common struggle for survival fostered a sense of unity. We found solace in each other's company, sharing stories and providing support wherever possible. The bonds formed in these harsh conditions were a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. The days in the Gulag were marked by a relentless routine, with little variation from one day to the next. The endless cycle of work, minimal food, and harsh discipline created a monotonous existence. Time seemed to stretch on indefinitely, each day blending into the next in a ceaseless struggle for survival. The Gulag was not just a place of imprisonment, but a place where the harshest aspects of human endurance were put to the test. It was a world defined by suffering and deprivation, where every moment was a battle against the relentless forces of nature and the brutality of the system. The experience in the Gulag was a profound ordeal, a stark reminder of the depths of human endurance and the enduring will to survive amidst the bleakest of circumstances. As the weeks turned into months, we adapted to the harsh realities of life in the Gulag. The struggle to maintain hope and humanity in the face of such adversity was an ongoing challenge. Each day in the Gulag was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a struggle to retain dignity and purpose amidst the relentless demands of survival. The Gulag was a crucible of suffering, but it was also a place where the strength of the human spirit was tested in the most profound ways. Survival in the Gulag was not just a matter of enduring the harsh physical conditions, it was an intricate dance of mental fortitude and daily strategy, a constant negotiation with the elements and the grim realities of imprisonment. Each day presented a new challenge, demanding adaptability and resilience in equal measure. In the harsh environment of the Gulag, survival became an art form, forged through ingenuity and sheer willpower. The first step in this grueling journey was mastering the art of conserving energy. The extreme cold was an omnipresent adversary, draining our strength and making every task feel insurmountable. To cope, we learned to move with a deliberate economy, reserving our energy for essential activities and avoiding unnecessary exertion. Each step was calculated, each movement measured. The bitter wind and relentless chill made every moment outside a battle, and we quickly adapted to the rhythm of survival, pacing ourselves to conserve warmth and stamina. Food was a constant struggle, a daily battle against hunger and malnutrition. The meager rations we received were barely enough to sustain us, let alone provide the energy needed for the back-breaking labor assigned to us. The Gulag's meals were a monotonous affair, a watery soup that often contained little more than bits of unidentifiable vegetables and a small piece of stale bread. The scarcity of nutrients and the lack of variety led to constant hunger and the slow erosion of our physical health. In response to this scarcity, resourcefulness became crucial. We scavenged every scrap of food we could find, trading small items with fellow prisoners and bartering for anything that might alleviate our hunger. Some prisoners became adept at cooking small portions of food using makeshift stoves fashioned from scraps of metal. These small victories, while insufficient to completely alleviate our hunger, provided momentary relief and a sense of control over our dire circumstances. The harsh living conditions also necessitated a focus on hygiene and health. The inadequate sanitation facilities made it essential to maintain a degree of cleanliness as best as we could. We fashioned makeshift washing stations from old containers and used ice-cold water sparingly to minimize exposure to the freezing temperatures. Despite these efforts, illness was a constant threat. The lack of proper medical care meant that even minor ailments could quickly escalate into serious health issues. The psychological aspect of survival was as crucial as the physical. The relentless monotony and harsh conditions wore down our spirits, making it essential to find ways to maintain mental resilience. Storytelling became a vital tool for coping. Gathered in small groups around the dim light of a single lamp, we shared tales of our pasts, dreams of the future, and stories from before the war. These moments of connection were more than just distractions, they were lifelines, helping us to maintain our sense of self and our hope for a better future. Another crucial element of survival was the formation of alliances and support networks. In the Gulag, trust was a rare and precious commodity, but building relationships with fellow prisoners provided a buffer against the isolation and despair. We formed small communities, sharing resources, information, and moral support. This camaraderie was essential in navigating the harsh realities of life in the Gulag. Each of us brought unique skills to the group, whether it was knowledge of food foraging, bartering skills, or the ability to provide emotional support. Work assignments were a significant part of our daily life, and adapting to the demands of labor was vital for survival. The work was physically demanding and often performed under severe conditions. We adapted by developing efficient techniques and learning to pace ourselves. The work details ranged from manual labor in freezing temperatures to tasks that involved long hours of standing or heavy lifting. Learning to work with a methodical approach and to support each other during tasks helped us endure the physical strain. The guards, while a constant presence, were often indifferent rather than overtly hostile. Their role was to enforce the rules and maintain order, but their behavior varied. Some were indifferent to the prisoners' suffering, while others displayed a more authoritarian attitude. Understanding their routines and behaviors allowed us to navigate the Gulag's social dynamics more effectively. Adapting to their presence and learning to avoid actions that might draw undue attention was part of the broader survival strategy. In the face of adversity, moments of small triumphs became significant milestones. Whether it was managing to secure a slightly better meal, successfully completing a challenging work detail, or finding a brief respite from the cold, these small victories provided crucial morale boosts. They served as reminders of our resilience and ability to endure despite the overwhelming odds. Survival in the Gulag was a relentless and multifaceted struggle. It required a balance of physical endurance, mental resilience, and social adaptability. The harsh conditions tested every aspect of our being, demanding a continuous adjustment to the challenges we faced. Each day was a testament to the power of the human spirit to endure, adapt, and survive in the face of extreme adversity. The Gulag, with its cold, isolation, and unyielding demands, became a crucible in which the essence of survival was forged, revealing both the limits and the strengths of human endurance.